This session is on out-of-country voting and technology, and you will notice in your tote bags that we have a white paper that IFES recently produced on out-of-country voting that will be a useful reference for you later on. So, like I said, welcome to this first panel on election technology and out-of-country voting. We have three distinguished panelists here with us, David Beirne, David Becker, and Ben Goldsmith, to talk about the issue of out-of-country voting and how technology is being utilized. Now, as background, I should mention that out-of-country voting has received greater resonance among election administrators in the United States over the past couple of election cycles. This is because, and also background, I should also point out that American civilians and military personnel who live overseas and want to vote in the U.S. elections have to vote through absentee mail-in ballots. There is no voting at embassies or consulates or in-person voting. It's through absentee balloting. And several studies had pointed out that a significant percentage of these out-of-country Americans, particularly military personnel, tend to be disenfranchised because of flaws that existed in the way the absentee ballots were distributed, received back, etc. And so because of that, over the last couple of election cycles in the United States, there has been a greater focus by federal authorities and by state-level officials to ease the way voters living overseas receive and send back absentee ballots. And it's led to some real improvements in the process, including using technology more effectively in order to get information out to voters, helping them ask for ballots and to get information on how they can vote more effectively. So our two panelists, David Beirne and David Becker, will speak specifically about the U.S. situation and how technology is being utilized in order to ease access to out-of-country voting for Americans living overseas. And in the third presentation, Ben Goldsmith, IFES's chief of party in Kosovo, will talk about how several countries are taking steps with internet voting in order to ease access to out-of-country voting. So they have three very interesting presentations on hand. I shouldn't take up much more of my time, of their time, so I will turn it over first to David Beirne. David is the acting deputy director of technology programs for the Federal Voter Assistance Program. Now, this is the agency which provides support to both voters and states to ensure that both military personnel and civilians overseas can vote. He has also served more than 10 years as an election official directly involved in the conduct of federal, state, and local elections in both Texas and Florida, and he's also served as the executive director of the Election Technology Council. I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Rakesh, and good morning. It's my pleasure to be here with you. Fortunately, given my role in support of the absentee voting process, given that tomorrow is a big election day, people are asking me, how are things going? And actually, my peak work activity was about 45 days ago, just getting everything prepared in support of our systems that we offer to active duty military and overseas civilian voters. So it's fortunate that my time is at least freed up now that I can be here with you today. And what I'd like to do is walk you through what the Federal Voting Assistance Program does, what its statutory authorization is, and how that all ties together in terms of the technology that we offer to active duty military and overseas civilians. Not sure where the receiver is. The Federal Voting Assistance Program operates under two primary statutory authorizations. One is the Uniformed and Overseas Absentee Voting Act of 1986, which established our office primarily within the Department of Defense in order to facilitate voting for active duty military and overseas civilians. It's important to note that our office does not serve as an election official. We serve as a primary resource or facilitator for those who wish to vote in elections. And I believe, based on what I understand from yesterday's discussions, the complexity of the U.S. election framework was definitely conveyed. And so our challenge is to digest all of the various state laws and rules and regulations and make sure we provide one concerted effort to educate our military and overseas civilian voters on the absentee voting process. Rakesh also mentioned the increased scrutiny that the Federal Voting Assistance Program has received in terms of absentee voting. And that leads to our second primary statutory authorization, which was passed in 2009. the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. What this requires is an expanded presence for the Department of Defense to implement installation voting assistance offices at all of our military installations, but also provides investment for additional technical resources and authorizes pilot programs offering new technology for active duty military and overseas civilians. Next slide, please. Part of our organization is, this is an inverted pyramid. It gives you a sense of the Department of Defense structure. At the unit voting assistance officer level, Federal Voting Assistance Program sits here at the bottom of the inverted pyramid. We provide guidance to the service secretaries. They serve in terms of the 5 military branches of the Department of Defense. They provide guidance throughout their infrastructure and their personnel on down to the senior service voting representative, all the way down to the unit voting assistance officer level, which we have thousands of unit voting assistance officers in the field. The requirement is for 1 unit voting assistance officer for every 25 active duty soldiers. So you can imagine the sheer breadth and scope of these unit voting assistance officers and their presence. So the reason I stress this is because although we have technology at our disposal, we also realize that there's the need for direct contact with military voters in the field and serving as that frontline resource for them. One of the other challenges that we face, and I think everyone here can appreciate it, is the logistical challenge of sending out absentee ballots and receiving them timely for local election officials. One of our challenges is dealing with United States Postal Service, but then also transferring absentee ballots that are outbound to active duty military and supporting them through what we call the Military Postal Service Agency. They are the ones who are responsible for distributing the ballots and directly delivering those ballots to active duty military in the field so they have time to vote them absentee and return them. For overseas civilians, we partner with and rely upon agreements with foreign postal services. 2 of our primary tools that we use within the Federal Voting Assistance Program are 2 standardized forms that are used and accepted universally throughout the United States. One is the Federal Postcard Application, the other one is the Federal Write-in and Absentee Ballot. The Federal Postcard Application ensures that active duty military, uniformed service voters, as well as overseas civilians can use this form to temporarily register and apply for a ballot for all federal elections within a calendar year. The Federal Write-in and Absentee Ballot is our backup mechanism that ensures that an active duty soldier or civilian overseas can cast a ballot if they did not receive their official ballot from their state or local election official. This ensures that they have one last opportunity to cast a ballot for federal contest. And if you can recall in 2000, and oftentimes if the election is close, these federal write-in absentee ballots do have a tendency to come in after Election Day and can receive significant scrutiny. So part of what we've been doing within the Federal Voting Assistance Program is offering online tools for active duty military and overseas civilians. We recognize that although we have voting assistance officers in the field, much of what they do is a secondary or third level responsibility. Especially in terms of the military, they have a number of primary responsibilities, and so the Federal Voting Assistance Program has taken on a new role to serve as a central resource. Through our website, fvap.gov, fvap.gov, we offer a Federal Postcard Online Wizard, which we integrated our new form to support the 2012 election cycle. We also deployed our Federal Write-in and Absentee Ballot Online Wizard, which was specifically configured to support throughout the presidential preference primary elections. We supported all of the state various structures, including an open or closed primary structure or hybrid for those states like California, the state of Washington, and others. We built in enhancements so that we could offer candidate listings just as they are prescribed within each of the states. And one of the other challenges for us was loading all of the redistricting data for the United States House of Representatives so that we could ensure that the voter who was submitting a transaction through our online wizard is receiving the proper listing of federal candidates for based on their residence. The FWAB wizard and the general theme that you'll find is that right now we are focused on online or electronic ballot, blank ballot delivery, or electronic ballot delivery, not the return of voted ballots. So our federal write-in absentee ballot online wizard permits the online marking of the ballot, in which the voter then downloads the PDF and then returns it through the postal system itself. Our job, though, within the Federal Voting Assistance Program is not just to provide technical resources, it's also to ease barriers for active duty military and overseas civilians. One of the things we've seen in recent years is new legislation passed at the state level to ease the burden for active duty military and overseas civilians. In reading from the top of the chart, beginning right here under these initiatives, the codified 45 days prior transmission requirement is something that was enacted within the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. This is a direct encouragement for state and local jurisdictions to make sure they are dispatching absentee ballots in enough time so that someone who is forward deployed, for example, in Afghanistan or Iraq, has an opportunity to return that ballot and make sure it is timely. In addition, we've also so what we reflect in this chart here is in 2007, this is the number of states and those states who had enacted these types of laws to ease the barriers. And then we go over to the right side, and now you can see the number of states that have moved in this general progression to really ease the process for our active duty military and overseas civilians. So in terms of accepting the federal write-in absentee ballot in state and local elections, we see this as increasing the franchise opportunity for our military and overseas civilians. Emailing blank ballots to our, what we refer to as HAVA voters. These are the Uniformed and Overseas Civilian and Absentee Voting Act requirements. Emailing blank ballots eliminates half of the traditional transit time associated with the absentee voting process. Requiring a notary. In the past, states had required a specific provision for an agent to notarize an absentee ballot. This was a significant burden, and this was eliminated in the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. And then finally, enact UMOVA. And UMOVA is simply a piece of legislation that is being moved across the United States to help standardize the election process and reduce the complexity of state rules and regulations. In particular, and I think in terms of the real subject matter of the program, I wanted to give you a sense of what the Federal Voting Assistance Program does, what our focus remains, but also we understand that we do not do it alone, and that we are not an election official. We are not an election body. So in terms of being a facilitator, we funded a competitive grant program for the states and local jurisdictions, those local election officials, to directly apply for funding. And this is all part of our pilot program research initiative. We want to find out exactly how successful are we in terms of offering online blank ballot delivery systems or online blank ballot marking systems that allow for a postal return. How successful is this in terms of reducing the challenge we face in our supporting logistics of allowing active duty military and overseas civilians to vote? So this map gives you a sense of exactly the coverage we offer. These are not all state solutions, however. In terms on the right side, the grant recipients themselves, it is in some instances a state solution, in other instances it is a local jurisdiction. But it does give you a general sense of the structure. We're very mindful of the security question in terms of any consideration of internet voting or the electronic return of voted ballots. In terms of our grant requirement, it was a competitive grant, and we focused on making sure that we were not funding any direct return of an electronically voted ballot. Again, the premise is that we deliver the ballots to the individual, they vote them, and then they return them through the postal methods. So supplementing that effort, the question is, well, can you really ensure that the ballot is returning to the local election official in a timely fashion? This is where we work directly with the United States Postal Service to create a new label. It's called the 11 DoD label for the Department of Defense. And this is applied to every single absentee ballot that is processed through the Military Postal Service Agency. This enables our active duty military voters the opportunity to track their absentee ballot throughout the process and ensure that it did, in fact, was received at the local election office. So this is an example of the screenshot demonstrating exactly what tracking capability is there. In terms of our overall transaction levels, for the 2012 election, just for your benefit, in 2012, you can see here the number of FPCAs is very much on par with what we experienced in 2008. The number of FWABs is also up, but we attribute that to general awareness of what we offer through our website. This also gives you a sense of the peak of volume that we experience. So when I refer to my workload, you can see the dramatic peak beginning in September towards the right side, and we have built towards a crescendo towards November. Again, the same slide demonstrating the same general story. You can see the January bump in terms of supporting the primaries in March, and then as we approach the November election. And then finally, one of our key resources that we observe is the number, who our key constituents are, and primarily all of our visitors come from the .mil, all of the Department of Defense and active duty military. They come in from a .mil domain, and so we can track that primarily our key constituents are active duty military, as well as those voters who are may not be accessing us through a government workstation, but they are residing here in the United States. So in summary, just real fast, and I know I'm going over a little bit of my time, but what we're focused on now is that our key observations is that activity levels for us are as expected for a presidential election in which an incumbent is running for re-election. When we compare it to 2004, the numbers are very much on par with our expectations. Since the enactment of the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, significant administrative barriers have been removed at the state and local level. So we expect, and our hypothesis is that we will see a dramatic increase in the success rate for our military and overseas civilians to cast ballots. And as we turn towards our post-election analysis and looking at our grants and the success of offering these technical solutions, we're going to be reviewing it for the effectiveness of these blank ballot delivery mechanisms in terms of whether they solve the fundamental challenge we face with transmitting ballots through postal means. And then finally, in terms of the election tomorrow, we will continue to work with state and local election officials to make sure we are answering any questions they might have in terms of the instruments they receive from overseas civilians as well as active duty military, to make sure that they have the information they need to properly accept or reject absentee ballots as they come in. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Rakesh.
Okay, excuse me. Thank you, David. It was interesting to learn about the logistical challenges that are faced in getting the absentee ballots requested and returned, and the sort of ballot delivery systems and other things that are being tested right now. Now I'll turn it over to David Becker. David is the director of the election initiatives for the Pew Center on the States. He supervises Pew's portfolio of work in election administration, including research and reform efforts to improve military and overseas voting, as well as assess election performance through better data, use technology to provide voters with information they need to cast a ballot, and upgrading of voter registration systems. In a previous position, David Becker also served as a senior trial attorney in the voting section of the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. David?
Thanks, Rakesh, and thank you all in IFES for having me here today. I work for the Pew Charitable Trusts. Pew is a large public charity. It's based in Philadelphia and here in Washington, D.C., with about 1,000 employees worldwide. We work in a variety of fields, and one of the fields in which we work is working through research to promote strong, efficient public policies at the state and federal level. And I work specifically in the area of election administration, trying to promote good policies there. With regard to overseas and military voting, back in 2009, we released a report called No Time to Vote, and it talked about a lot of the things you just heard from David, that there were significant problems when it came to voting for those who were overseas and serving in our military. It turned out that 25 states and D.C. did not provide enough time for the military and overseas voters to receive their ballots from their local election jurisdiction here in the States and return it in time so it would be counted. One of the challenges we face here in the States, as many of you know, I think, is that due to our federal system, we have 50 different states plus D.C. and the territories that all have their different election laws. And within those 50 states, we have 10,000 different election jurisdictions that actually run elections in the States. So this poses a challenge for those seeking to serve those, especially overseas and serving in our military, who don't have easy access to their election officials here at home. So we made 4 recommendations as a result of this report. First, that every jurisdiction send out their ballots at least 45 days in advance of the election. That would afford enough time for it to travel all the way to the voter, give them a few days to review the ballot and vote it, and then return it in time so it would be received by election officials by Election Day. Second, allowing blank ballots to be transmitted to voters electronically. 3, eliminating witness and notary requirements. As David mentioned, many states, 8 states, still had them at the time of this report. And then finally, expanding and enhancing the use of the federal write-in absentee ballot, which again, as David mentioned, is effectively a fail-safe for those who are overseas. If they don't receive their ballot in time, they can still download this federal write-in absentee ballot and submit it so that they can get their votes counted. There have been significant developments after we issued this report. First, in October of 2009, President Obama signed the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. That was the first significant piece of legislation in this area to have occurred since the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, which we often call HAVA, even though that's a mouthful. That was passed in 1986. So it was about 2 decades, over 2 decades later, the MOVE Act, as we call it, was passed, and that implemented a lot of our recommendations. Then, in the summer of 2010, the Uniform Law Commission approved what David mentioned as we call UMUVA, excuse me, the Uniform Military and Overseas Voters Act, which extended even further protections to the state. It expanded the protections of the MOVE Act, which only applied to federal elections, to all elections, to state and local elections. And it simplified and standardized the process for military and overseas voters. This is a real problem for overseas voters in the United States. Because we've got so many laws that apply, 50 different states, D.C., plus the territories, 10,000 election jurisdictions, it's often very difficult for those overseas and serving in our military to know exactly who they're supposed to contact, what rules apply, and this act was sought to try to standardize some of those issues. And so that culminated in the early part of this year with another report we released called Democracy from Afar, which indicated that there had been significant improvements since 2008 due to the hard work of people like the Federal Voting Assistance Program and others who work in this field to try to make it simpler for overseas and military voters to cast ballots that will be counted. And as a result, in 2010 and 2011, 47 states and D.C. passed laws further protecting military and overseas voters. I think it's safe to say at this point in our nation's history that military and overseas voters have never been better protected than they have been today. That's not to say there doesn't still need to be significant work to improve the system for them, but I think they have as good a system in place as they ever have to this point. So now, at least 46 states and D.C. send ballots to military and overseas voters at least 45 days before an election. All states and D.C. allow military and overseas voters to receive blank ballots electronically, although there is still some discussion and there is an ongoing dispute about whether or not internet voting is actually ready for prime time here in the United States. There is very little dispute that it is safe and secure to send unvoted ballots to voters overseas electronically so then they can be returned by mail. That cuts, as David indicated, the total transit time of the ballot by half. Now, 46 states and D.C. do not require either a witness or notary for military and overseas voters. As David indicated, no states require a notary, which is a particularly difficult process for overseas voters. Only about 4 states require a witness still at this point. And now 34 states and D.C. mandate that federal write-in absentee ballots be used as backup ballots for all elections, including state and local elections. Even though the federal law only applied to federal elections, states have now voluntarily passed laws to require it to be accepted for all elections. 10 states in D.C. have now passed that Uniform Military and Overseas Voting Act, which I mentioned before, and 3 more states have introduced the bill in 2012. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some technological tools that are available for voters overseas and serving in the military that were not available before, that we're pretty proud of. One of the tools that Pew has been involved with is called the Voting Information Project, which can be accessed at votinginfoproject.org. This is a snapshot of the front page. And on that site, there's an embeddable tool for military and overseas voters that any website can embed. And is being used by several states, which allows them to simplify the process. What military and overseas voters really need is often, it's very difficult to get this information. Get information on registration deadlines, which vary by state, and get forms like the federal postcard application. Information on where and how to request a ballot, again, that varies by state. And instructions on how to navigate the process of returning ballots using backups like the federal absentee ballot, write-in absentee ballot. So as I mentioned, this military and overseas voting tool is embeddable on any website and features all the tools accessible to a voter just by entering the address at which the voter is registered here in the United States. This is what it looks like when you first get to it. You just put in that box there, the mailing address where you reside in the United States. And what will pop up is something that looks like this. It'll give you links to your local election officials and information on local election laws. You can even get the ballot automatically downloaded from that jurisdiction, and it'll give you registration and absentee ballot information. This tool, this is the first time a tool like this has been available to voters overseas and serving in the military. Now, one other problem and one other challenge that voters overseas and serving in the military have is keeping their information up to date. People who are overseas, people who are serving in the military are particularly mobile, and thus are particularly reliant upon having accurate, up-to-date addresses on their voter records. As I've indicated before, as with everything else, voter registration records, your voter record, is held by the states. It varies by state, and the ability of states to be able to keep up with people's mobility is not particularly good. Military and overseas voters need to make sure they have the right address on file because they need to make sure they get their ballot sent to the right place. They have limited time to receive and return their ballot as it is, and so if it goes to the wrong place, they might find themselves in trouble. And we know in the United States that voter records are notoriously inaccurate and can be inconvenient to update. This is a problem that we've researched, and we put out a report earlier this year in February that indicated about 1 in 8 registration records in the United States is no longer up to date, not because of any kind of fraud or any kind of manipulation, but just because Americans are highly mobile as a society. About 1 in 8 Americans moves in any given year. About 1 in 4 young Americans moves in any given year, and it's very, very difficult to keep up with that mobility if you're an election official. So as I mentioned, about 1 in 8 Americans moved in any given year. And some Americans are much more transient, particularly military personnel, overseas voters, young people, and those affected by the recent economic downturn. What we also know is about 30% of Americans move between presidential elections. So again, if you're an election official in the United States, you have a challenge because you need to try to find where those people are and get the information updated as much as possible. One of the tools that we have found at Pew to be particularly effective is online voter registration. Online voter registration is more accurate because voters directly input their information rather than the way most people register in the United States still today, on paper with pen in their own handwriting, which then needs to be delivered to a government official to try to decipher their handwriting and often input that data in a very compressed period of time, because so much activity occurs in the 30 to 45 days before a presidential election in the United States. They have to get all of that information, often thousands, hundreds of thousands of forms, input into their system in just 30 days before an election occurs. Online registration costs less. It only costs about 3 cents to process an online registration versus about 83 cents for a paper form. We know that voters prefer it. In states like Arizona, which has had online registration for over a decade, 4 out of 5 registrations now come in electronically because voters prefer that method. And to give you an idea, this is what online voter registration looked like in 2008. Only Washington and Arizona had online voter registration for the presidential election in 2008. And this is what it looks like in 2012. This is a trend that is continuing to grow. There are now 13 states that offer online voter registration, including very large states like California and New York. So whereas only about 10 million Americans had access to online voter registration in 2008, nearly 100 million do in 2012. That's bred a tremendous number of efficiencies. One other recommendation we have had is for states to share data better so that they can keep up with voters who have moved between states. This is a particular challenge for states. And so one of the things that we have helped states do is build a data center that we call the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC. And what this allows states to do is share data between the states to try to find when someone has moved between the states, and not just discover it right before a presidential election, but discover it at the point in time the move occurs. For this election, 7 states are participating in this project: Washington, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. And Pew will be studying it to see how the efficiencies grow out of that, whether costs are saved. We believe it's going to lead to much greater accuracy in the rolls as well. So more accurate lists allow states to keep up with the mobile electorate, better identify voters who have moved and died, find and reconcile duplicates. Because of paper forms, election officials are plagued by duplicate registrations, particularly that come in right before a presidential election. There'll be cost savings, less printing costs. Paper forms cost money to print, of course. There's less wasted mail. When you have a bad voter record, you send mail to a voter, but that voter might no longer be there, and that's a tremendous problem. And a reduction in the returned mail that gets returned by the Postal Service because the person no longer lives there. That takes time and money to process as well from election offices. And then finally, fewer provisional ballots to process. Probably most of you know we have a fail-safe here in the United States called a provisional ballot, where if your information doesn't match the record the election official has on file, you're allowed to cast a provisional ballot that's separated from the rest of the ballots. But it takes longer to process those ballots, and some of those ballots often don't get counted. So it's desirable to try to minimize the number of provisional ballots necessary. And then finally, the process will be more efficient. As I mentioned, we'll be able to update the records when changes occur, not just right before a presidential election. There'll be less paper overall, which election offices love. Reducing the role of third-party voter registration groups. Right now, so much of the responsibility of voter registration in the United States falls upon third-party groups, political campaigns, political parties. That generates a lot of paper, it generates a lot of duplicates, it generates a lot of inefficiencies. If that role can be reduced, efficiency will be increased. And also, I'm sure many of you have heard, there are those who believe that fraud is quite possible. There's a difference of opinion about whether or not it actually occurs to any degree, but public perception does lean towards the belief that fraud is possible. So whenever we can improve the accuracy of the list, we can reduce that public perception, which is very, very important. And that's all. And if you have any other further questions, you can find more information on our website or reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was very interesting, and especially interesting to learn about the efforts on voter registration, because that is a issue which causes a lot of problems here in the United States. So I think with David and David's presentations, I think you get a good sense of the complexity of the overseas voting system here in the United States, and hopefully some of the technological initiatives they've outlined will lead to better access for our overseas voters in the future. So now what we'll do is broaden our focus more internationally and look at what some countries are doing in terms of internet voting and using electronic voting in order to ease access for persons living overseas, citizens living overseas. So I'd like to introduce Ben Goldsmith, who is our Chief of Party in Kosovo, IFES's Chief of Party Kosovo. He's a senior electoral advisor with 15 years experience advising and managing election administration projects in post-conflict and developing democracy. As I mentioned, he's our Chief of Party in Kosovo, and he also has extensive experience in a number of different regions, including Europe, South Asia, and the Middle East, and he has managed projects in over 30 countries. He has written articles and reports on out-of-country voting, Central Asian politics, Afghan elections, electronic feasibility studies, and internet voting. So, Ben.
Okay, thank you very much, Rakesh. As Rakesh said, I would like to say a few words today on the issue of voting technology, and particularly internet voting, as it's often seen as a solution to some of the challenges we saw in enfranchising voters who are overseas, as well as other kinds of voters as well. And this research comes from work that IFES has recently done in Norway. Norway did an internet voting pilot in 2011, and they did a very comprehensive evaluation of the pilot, and IFES was asked to evaluate 3 different areas of their pilot project. And one of those areas was an evaluation of global experiences of electronic voting and also internet voting. So it's those 2 areas that I would like to present briefly to you today. Now, when we came to look at this research, we had to decide when would we consider a country to have actually used one of these technologies. Because certainly if I take the UK as an example, there are regular uses of internet voting for trade union elections, for neighbourhood associations, for student union elections, but this really didn't seem to meet the mark for having considered a country to have used this kinds of technology. So we decided that we would only include countries where a binding political election to an assembly or a parliament or a regional body or to a political office like the president, where the technology had been used for that kind of election. And this certainly narrowed the field down quite considerably to the number of countries that had used these technologies. And I guess we also needed to think about what we meant by internet voting. We've seen some other uses of the internet to assist the voting process from the other speakers here, the delivery of ballots to voters, the receipt of ballots from voters using internet means. But again, we didn't see that as necessarily being internet voting. For us, internet voting was where the internet was used as a medium to cast the vote and to record the vote directly onto some sort of electronic ballot box. If we look at an overview of electronic voting experiences, for EVM voting experiences, the first use of electronic voting machines dates back to the 1970s, but there were very few countries actually using machines at that point, and they only became more prominent in the 1990s and subsequently to that. And we found, in the research we did, we found that there were 30 countries which had used electronic voting machines for binding political elections. In 9 cases, countries had piloted and discontinued the use of these electronic voting machines. In 7 cases, the countries were still piloting EVMs and considering whether to use them longer term. In 11 countries, the EVMs were currently being used, and in 3 cases, they're being used for the entire electorate. And in 3 other cases, the use of electronic voting machines had been discontinued. And within this overall data, we saw some very, very different trends in different regions of the world. So in the US, we saw that after the Help America Vote Act, there was a move towards using election technologies, and particularly to using electronic voting machines. But I think because of problems that were experienced in using electronic voting machines, there was then a shift away from EVMs into electronic counting machines. So I think the dominant technology that's now used in the US is the electronic counting of paper votes. And EVMs is less used, although it's still a significant, it's used in a significant number of states and jurisdictions. In terms of Europe, we also saw a move towards using electronic voting machines from 2000 onwards. But we saw some significant examples of countries which were either piloting EVMs or had been using them for a while, and they took a decision to move away from them. So we saw the case of Ireland, of the Netherlands, of Germany, of the UK, where a conscious decision was taken to say we're not going to use electronic voting machine anymore. We're concerned about, for example, security issues in using electronic voting machines. In terms of South America, we see a very different trend. we see some important countries in South America, like Brazil and Venezuela, which are using electronic voting machines for all of their elections, for all of their electorate. And we see other countries which are following them in that lead, for example, Peru and Argentina. And in Asia, we also see the example of a big and important country, India, which has been using electronic voting machines for all of its national and state elections since 2004, and just using electronic voting machines. And we see other countries in the region which are following India's lead in many ways, and either experimenting with electronic voting machines or considering the use of electronic voting machines. So we see Bangladesh, Pakistan, Thailand, Indonesia, all at some stage of consideration or piloting these technologies. And I think this contrasts very starkly with the experiences of internet voting. And we see the first use of internet voting for a binding political election in 2000 in the US. And usage again grew through the next 5 or 6 years until we had about 4 to 6 countries regularly each year using internet voting for elections. Now, of course, there were more countries that were actually using it, but they didn't necessarily have an election every single year. And now we see that there have been 12 countries around the world which have used internet voting for binding political elections. And again, the experience is very mixed. We see some countries which have used them, they've piloted them, and then moved away from them. So the United Kingdom trialed the use of internet voting between 2002 and 2007, and took a decision not to continue those pilots. The Netherlands used internet voting over a couple of national elections, and then took a move away from all forms of electronic voting, including internet voting. The city of Barcelona in Spain conducted a referendum which used internet voting, and because of problems with security and voter impersonation, they again decided that they would not use internet voting again in the future. And Finland trialed internet voting, this time in the controlled environment of the polling station, but again, because of challenges in using internet voting, decided they would not continue trials with it. But there are 4 countries now which are consistently using internet voting. We see Canada using it for local and municipal and city council elections. Not in large numbers, but there are probably, at a guess, 10 to 20 different municipalities which are using internet voting. In Estonia, internet voting is now used for all elections as a complement to paper balloting. So they've used it in local elections, in parliamentary elections, in European elections, and in presidential elections. France also uses internet voting to enable its expatriate voters to participate in the electoral process. And Switzerland has a long experience of using internet voting, predominantly for referendums, cantonal referendums. And there are other countries which are in the process of moving towards the adoption of internet voting, I would say. New South Wales in Australia has adopted legislation which allows internet voting, and they used it in their 2011 state elections. Norway has now piloted it in local government elections, and it remains to be seen if they will continue using it in larger scale pilots. And also, I missed it off this slide, but India, the state of Gujarat, also trialed the use of internet voting in its local elections in 2011. So we're seeing very different trends here. In terms of the scope of internet voting usage, for many countries it serves a very specific purpose. So the Netherlands used it specifically to enfranchise expatriate voters. Again, when it was trialled in the US on 2 occasions, it was used specifically for overseas voters and particularly targeted towards military voters. Switzerland has unusual legislation in some respects, in that where it uses internet voting, which has been 3 cantons of Switzerland, it's only been allowed to provide internet voting to 20% of the electorate. I think this is a provision they're looking at to revise in the future, with the possibility of allowing a much larger scale use of internet voting. And Australia specifically used internet voting to allow voters who are overseas, voters who are away from their polling station on election day, voters who had disabilities, or voters who lived a long way from the polling station, to be able to cast an internet vote. And I think we see only one election in the city of Barcelona which was entirely done by the internet. In all of the cases, the internet has been an alternative to paper balloting, either in the polling station or postal voting for overseas voters. And I think I would say that these global trends in the use of internet voting are largely defined by the challenges that we see, because it's not an easy thing to implement. And I think in looking at the experiences around the world of using internet voting, we can identify a number of different challenges. I think first and maybe foremost is trust. How can we trust the system when we can't see how it functions, the mechanics of it? And I guess we just need to compare it to paper voting in the polling station to understand how different internet voting is. With paper voting, you can see every stage of the process. You can verify, observers can verify that the process was conducted properly and the results reflect the will of the voters and the votes have been counted properly. You don't get that same level of transparency with internet voting, and this is a real challenge. It's a challenge from two perspectives. One, I think, to ensure that the election has integrity, that internet voting does reflect the will of the voters. But secondly, to guarantee trust. I think as election administrators, I always say that we face two challenges. One is to deliver an election that reflects the will of the people, and the second is to convince people that we've delivered an election that reflects the will of the people. And you can do the first without doing the second, and if you don't do the second, the election can be a failure because people don't trust the results. So I think internet voting provides a lot of challenges in this regard, in not only ensuring integrity, but convincing people that the process has integrity. And I think it requires additional measures to make sure this is the case. So you need to make sure, a key thing with internet voting, I think, is to make sure that the process is verifiable, that you can check that each stage of the process has functioned correctly, and that the results that you receive at the end do reflect the will of the voters who participated. And I think this requires additional oversight mechanisms for observers, for political party representatives, for election administrators as well. I think a second key challenge I would point to is the secrecy and freedom of the vote. In the controlled environment of the polling station, you can ensure to a fairly reasonable degree that voters are exercising their right to vote in an environment free of coercion. I think with any form of remote voting, including internet voting, you cannot necessarily guarantee that. I would make the comparison with postal voting, because I think that you also cannot guarantee it with postal voting. And I think this issue is often neglected when the debate about internet voting takes place. People say, well, you can't necessarily guarantee the secrecy and the fact that the voter is free from coercion, but you also can't for postal voting, and yet we accept postal voting. That's not to say it's a perfect voting approach, but I think that we need to accept that some of the challenges that you have with internet voting are also there with postal voting. And I would even say that there may be some ways that you can deal with these better with internet voting than postal voting. And I know that some of my colleagues up here may disagree with that. I think we also see that in terms of secrecy and freedom of the vote, you can have a conflict of interest. You want to make the process verifiable, but the easiest ways to make internet voting verifiable are going to violate the secrecy of the vote. So you have to find a solution to trying to meet both of these requirements, secrecy and verifiability. And I think you can see in some of the examples of internet voting that additional measures have been used to try and protect the secrecy of the vote. So I think the Norwegian case is a very good example. They were very aware of the challenge of ensuring that votes were cast without coercion and were secret. So they allowed voters to cast multiple internet votes. You could keep voting as many times as you want. So someone could coerce you to vote in a certain way, and an hour later you cast another internet vote free from coercion, hopefully. And the last internet vote cast was the one that was counted. They also allowed people to cast a paper ballot. And there was an extended period of paper voting before the election. Any paper ballot cast superseded an internet ballot. And I think this was a very strong protection against coercion and ensured the secrecy of the vote, so that even if you observed someone casting an internet vote, you would never know if that was the vote that was actually counted. So it also took away the incentive for manipulation and coercion of the voter. Okay, let me try and finish quickly. A couple of other challenges: voter identification and authentication. I think this is one of the biggest challenges for internet voting. How do you make sure that the person who's meant to cast that internet vote is that actual person? And I would say that we need to rely on strong online identification mechanisms for this. And I think another key challenge is that stakeholders would have to adapt to internet voting. It changes the relationship that stakeholders have with the electoral process. They need to become a lot more savvy and knowledgeable about internet voting so that they can properly observe it and provide oversight of internet voting. In conclusion, let me just say that I think there are a number of requirements for successful internet voting, and many of these are very challenging, so it's not the solution for every country and every jurisdiction, but internet voting needs to be conducted with transparency. There needs to be verifiability through the process. It needs to include stakeholders throughout the process in terms of the decision-making process and the observation and oversight of internet voting. Again, I say strong online identification mechanisms are essential, I think, for good internet voting. And secrecy protection provisions are also a requirement. In terms of the future of internet voting, I would say it's almost inevitable in some ways that we will move towards internet voting in the future. I'm certainly not saying it's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years, but I can't imagine in 50 years' time that we will all be casting paper votes in polling stations. So there are many challenges, I think, to be dealt with in terms of internet voting. I think solutions will be found, and I think inevitably we will probably move towards internet voting at some point in the future, maybe just as a complement to paper balloting, though. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Interesting, and as internet use expands globally, I think there will be more and more calls from citizens for why we can't use internet for voting. I think some of the challenges that Ben outlined are things that election administrators and others will have to address in order to move forward in terms of internet voting. So 3 very interesting presentations. Now I'll open it up to the floor for questions. I think there should be IFES representatives walking around. If you have a question, if you could just raise your hands, we'll ask the question. Okay. Yes, right here. Oh, right there. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Diman Simajuntak. I am from USA, Indonesia. I have a couple of simple questions. The first is, this is for voters overseas. If they vote by paper, how they can make sure that their ballot paper is actually arrived and then counted in the district? And my second question is about this is about the overseas also. Can parties or candidates do a campaign in overseas? Well, the campaigner do not have to from America, because for instance in Indonesia there are thousands of Americans citizens. Maybe they are member of a certain party or pro for a candidate, but can they do like a campaign in overseas country for the benefit of candidate or party in United States? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So David, what about voters being able to verify that the ballot they sent in has been cast and counted?
Well, and I'm assuming you mean David Beirne.
Yes.
In terms of overseas civilians, part of the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act in 2009 did require states to deploy a tracking service so that at the local election office level, an absentee voter can verify that if their ballot was dispatched and then also if it was received. In terms of whether the ballot's received at the local election office, that's all that means. It does not necessarily mean that it was actually entered tabulation because it goes through that separate canvassing process for the absentee ballot itself. So in a nutshell, I mean, that's what's available currently to them. In addition, I mentioned also the use of the 11 DOD label for active duty military, and there are also a number of commercial equivalents that are also available to them, including those who drop off ballots at U.S. embassies and consulates.
I'd just add very briefly, in the United States, virtually all voters cannot confirm that their ballot was counted. The exception largely is for those who cast provisional ballots. By law, there has to be a way to confirm whether or not a provisional ballot was counted or not. But once you cast a ballot, there's really no way to go back and verify whether or not it was counted or not.
Okay. And what about, I don't think there are any provisions against campaigning by parties overseas, for overseas voters, are there?
I think one of the challenges is how do you campaign efficiently overseas? Because this is a fairly disparate population, so it's not easy to do that. But there are Republicans and Democrats abroad groups that seek to engage with the voters who are overseas. I think that's probably one of the most significant ways that they do that.
Okay. We have a couple of questions. I'm assuming this is, oh, okay. One has to do with internet voting. The question is, we have been informed that some states in the U.S. have decided to move away from internet voting. What are the main reasons for this decision? I'm assuming this was in the primary yesterday. Are you?
I'll just, I mean, I think the reason, Ben had a really great list of what needs to be done with regard to internet voting. I think for most jurisdictions in the United States, the integrity and verifiability of the system is the #1 concern. Many of the other concerns, I think, are second to that.
I can speak. I can also speak to some general context. Ben referenced a pilot program that was conducted in the United States in 2000. That was called Voting Over the Internet, and that was actually the catalyst for an outstanding requirement in terms of the Federal Voting Assistance Program to examine a one-time demonstration project that would expand the pilot in 2000 to a much larger population group. Where we stand currently is that we are actively working with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as the United States Election Assistance Commission, to adopt the relevant security standards that must be in place for such a system. In terms of individual states, the complexity in the United States is that each state is really left to their own devices and in dictating what they feel they're comfortable with doing. So we actually see in some states they have moved forward with accepting the return of voted ballots by email, or in some instances they're looking at some form of voted ballot return electronically. In terms of the U.S. Department of Defense, right now our focus is on looking at the viability of online or electronic ballot delivery, but not the ballot return until such time we have those standards are in place. David Becker also, I think, hit on the key aspects, which are the transparency and verifiability. To me, those are the two big points that require consensus, and we are very mindful of the security threats in terms of any type of system that the Department of Defense would be deploying or anyone in the United States that would be considering. And I think the question is, how do you make the equivalency between the traditional postal balloting system versus an internet one, and recognizing what potential trade-offs exist and how best do you satisfy the observers. And I think that's really the critical threshold that must be satisfied for us, and that's what we're looking for those standards to address.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Will Zberov for Russia. One of the indicators of the efficiency of technology out of the country voting is turnout or suffrage. My question is, could somebody of you give me data about the trends of the military participation voting of the country voting? Thank you.
Trends in military voting?
Take it first.
I'll take a crack at it first. The overall trends in military voting, like anything, it requires an analysis of the numbers. And from what we've seen, keep in mind that the military population is disproportionately representing the 18 to 24-year-old demographic. And so in that regard, traditionally, that demographic votes less. But when you do control for age, at least in terms of the 2010 midterm elections, we did see that the active duty military rate was similar to the civilian. However, it's a question of how we define success. And success for us is, did the person apply for a ballot, and was that ballot properly received and then subsequently tabulated? And I think that's really where our focus is now, is that while the participation rates may be on par, and we'll see how it is fleshed out after the 2012 election, I think that we do still recognize that the participation rate can be high, but the success rate may be disproportionately low because of logistical challenges.
I just add briefly that we'll know a lot more about turnout after the election, because we won't get 2012 numbers until post-election. But turnout, as it is, and I would imagine in most countries, is driven by many factors in the United States. that can impact turnout. In 2008, turnout was about roughly 65% of eligible voters. Turnout in the 2010 non-presidential congressional elections was only about 40% of eligible voters. So we see waves of turnout go, and they can be affected by a variety of factors.
Okay. And what about you mentioned registration. Registration rates for military or overseas voters, are they significantly different from the general population, or?
I have not seen any data indicates that they're significantly different than the regular population. The general population in the United States, about 75% of eligible voters are registered nationwide. We are constantly working to improve that. That's not high enough. But I have not seen any data that indicates military voters register at a lower rate. Have you, David?
Nor have I. And the one challenge for us that we face is that I mentioned the federal postcard application, and David mentioned the transient nature of, especially of our military. The federal postcard application, in some instances, does serve as a permanent registration vehicle in certain states and jurisdictions. But in others, it's just a temporary registration for that one calendar year. And so that's what makes it difficult for us to measure, is to say, you know, are they permanently registered or are they temporarily registering based on where they are stationed? And I think that's the ongoing challenge we have. I know that we continue to look at levels of data standardization and how we can try to, you know, develop a better assessment mechanism, and that's where groups like Pew have been leaders in this regard, and so we look forward to working with them.
Yes, Sharma.
Thank you. There are different categories of overseas voters, and I think one of the challenges is when expat communities and expat constituencies are those categories of overseas voters. Surely, if one combines the complexities that arise with expatriate voting constituencies overseas with internet voting, one creates and compounds the credibility issues that could arise in the circumstances of those combined issues coming together. Internet-based voting for expat voter overseas constituencies. Different countries will have different contingencies around the in-principle debate on expat constituencies voting. But surely the two coming together compound credibility issues in certain contexts much more.
Ben?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you identify a big challenge for internet voting. I think it comes down to online identification mechanisms. I mean, some expatriates from countries still maintain identity documents from those countries, which could be used in a secure manner to identify themselves online and to register for votes and then to cast votes. I think Estonia is a good example of this. I mean, it has a very mobile population which goes and works in countries surrounding Estonia, and they have this smart ID card system which is used for many government services. This is one of the points I didn't get to stress really. The online identification mechanism shouldn't just be for voting, because then there's no inherent value in it, and it's much more susceptible to being sold to someone and to let them vote for you. If it's tied into other services from the state, like healthcare, like taxation, like banking, then it's a much stronger form of identification. And I think where you have this infrastructure, this identity infrastructure, you can deal with some of these challenges which are particularly prevalent amongst expatriate populations.
Okay. We have two questions from the audience which are basically on the same issue, so I'll read them both. Some developing countries are pushed by electoral assistance providers to adopt e-voting. Do you really think the system is advisable today for developing countries? And another related question, given the experiences of many countries that have tried and discontinued the use of e-voting, would you recommend this for developing countries? Ben, you worked a lot in countries.
Yes, I mean, certainly when I've dealt with on this issue, I've tried to advise people to take a very cautious approach to it, and not see electronic voting or internet voting as the solution to all of the problems that a country may face in terms of elections. It's a very, very complex issue. It's a very, very difficult decision. Countries need to really consider it, to do a full cost-benefit analysis, to be very, very clear what they're trying to achieve by introducing technology. In many places, the challenges that they face, the problems that they may face in elections can be dealt with by adapting the existing system, by taking procedures and protocols and making them stronger. And I think in many countries this can help deal with a lot of the challenges that people have, that the countries have in elections. Technology does have additional benefits, but it also has additional challenges. And I would just urge any election management body or country considering the use of e-voting or internet voting to very, very carefully consider it and to include all stakeholders in that consideration and decision-making process, because different stakeholders will have very different perspectives on these issues and can raise some very, very important issues which will need to be addressed if technologies are used.
Okay. Any back there, Aaron?
This is a question from the Armenian delegation, Tigran Mukuchan, Chairman, Central Election Commission. First question is, are military voting lists accessible to the general public? And the second question is campaigning allowed in military units?
David? Beirne?
I think that if I understood the first question was if the list of military voters is available to the public. The answer is that generally yes, but that would be coming from the local jurisdiction. There are some restrictions in place. I'll put on my previous hat as a local election official, in that in some instances it may not be available until the ballot is received if the election is ongoing. And then once the election is concluded, it would be available for general voter history purposes and for campaigns and others to take and audit the election. And then the other question was whether there's active campaigning allowed within the military. No, there is not. There is a federal provision in the United States Code that prohibits any type of coercion or exertion of influence on from senior officers down to enlisted. So we take that very seriously, and we issue guidance within the Department of Defense throughout the election cycle, reiterating exactly what are the limitations. And so we make sure we encourage, but there is no requirement. You absolutely cannot march anyone to a polling place to have them vote.
Okay. David, do you have any? Okay. I think Noreen, yes.
Steve Gray, IFES Moldova. On the overseas voting, a couple of questions. How many absentee ballot requests have there been? What's the breakdown between military versus just overseas voters? And how much does it cost per vote?
Okay. David or
do you have
David?
data, or do you want me? You can go for it. Do you have data on the number?
It's actually, that's all we can provide in the slides I showed during my presentation. All they demonstrate are the actual transaction volumes that we've experienced through our systems and on the website. Because of the fragmented nature of U.S. elections, I don't have any type of complete breakdown as to the full number. But certainly, David, did you want to speak to the?
No, I mean, the data is still coming in is the short answer. There were some initial concerns that there was a reduction in the number of requests for overseas and military ballots. I think those concerns were largely proven to not be accurate. I think the number of requests has tracked pretty closely to 2008. Some states have seen an increase. In most cases, to be able to get down to the level where you can differentiate between overseas and military is very challenging. And so there often has not been good data. We don't even have really solid numbers of how many eligible overseas, in other words, non-military voters, there are. There are estimates we feel fairly confident about. Most estimates I see put it in the range of around 3 to 6 million, right?
That's correct.
Okay. But we can't tell you, at least I can't tell you whether it's closer to 6 million or closer to 3 million.
And in terms of the overall, the reports that came out indicating the transactions are much lower than in past histories or past election cycles, generally that's, like David mentioned, proven not to be true based on direct feedback with the states. I used the 2004 election as the benchmark just because that was the last time we had an incumbent president running for election. Typically, when there is no incumbent, we expect a spike in the level of turnout.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Cost. I don't have the numbers. I know it can range from anywhere from $1 a vote to $3 a vote. But that's based on not my experience with the Department of Defense, but actually experience as a local election official.
We've been trying to study, and we have been studying costs to administer elections overall throughout the United States. And one of the challenges that anyone studying this has is that the answer might be different in one county from its next door county. So and not only that, they also often account for costs in different ways. So in order to get to that, you can't send out a general request for your data on costs and get answers back. So that's one of the things that we're constantly challenged to do. But I don't think anyone would disagree that it is more expensive often to reach out to overseas and military voters, but that is money well spent.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay. Nouri Abbar from Libya, the chairman of High National Commission. The trust is a big challenge in the internet voting. My question is how we can build this trust, especially in the countries who's in the transition period like Libya or Spring Arab.
Ben, trust as an issue for internet voting and just trust generally in the election process.
I agree, and I think this is why you see the countries which have used internet voting are generally countries which have high levels of trust in government and the election administration. I think it would be risky to implement internet voting in a situation where the election management body was not trusted. And even when the election management body is trusted, you need to implement many additional mechanisms to provide oversight and develop trust amongst the stakeholders, starting from the very beginning of the process through decision making, through piloting, through evaluation, letting stakeholders have access to materials and documents and test reports and certification process documents. So I think it's a difficult process to maintain trust in internet voting. It's not impossible, but it's certainly it's even more difficult where there's a lack of trust in the election management body.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. I'm from Nepal, Chief Election Commissioner of Nepal, Nilo Predi. Actually, after hearing all these panelists, after listening particularly Ben about the research he has made in the use of internet voting and e-voting, and also the postal voting and pre-voting, absentee voting, then would you suggest us that one day, the election day, will have no voting and we'll have all the voting done previous and before that E-Day, and we, people of developing democracy, will have to move ahead faster than we are moving for internet voting and e-voting?
Yeah, well, actually you're seeing that in the US more and more now. I think in states like Nevada, 60–70% of the people will vote before election day. But what about early voting? Are we moving towards that, where a lot of the voting will take place before election day?
Well, the trends certainly are going in that direction. Oregon and Washington vote entirely by mail. Every single person votes by mail there, meaning almost everyone has voted before election day, released their ballot, sent it in before election day. There are states like California and Colorado which offer many options, including what they call permanent absentee ballot status, where you can still vote on election day, but you can request that you always receive your ballot by mail and return it in. And in those states, numbers approaching 50% of all voters have chosen to vote by mail all the time. Certainly in states where there is early voting, we're seeing a large percentage of, 35–40% of voters voting early. So I think the trends are that it's continuing to go that way. We have a term for it. We call it convenience voting as well, where your options are multiple, that you could choose to vote early in the privacy of your own home by mail, early in person, or you could, there is still a sense among many Americans that the communal aspect of going and voting on election day with your fellow citizens has value. So there's a lot of people who choose to vote that way as well. I think we'll continue to see trends in that direction.
Yeah, it's interesting you call it convenience voting. I voted early and I stood in line for 2 hours in the cold. It wasn't very convenient. Yes.
Thank you very much. Mine is on internet voting and e-voting. I listened to Professor Alex Handelman from the University of Michigan, who did some hacking on the Washington D.C. internet voting system, and I was going to ask Ben Goldsmith on the panel. These countries which have done internet voting, or which have done e-voting, or those which have piloted and then discontinued, during this period, have they invited the public to actually try and hack into the system to ensure the integrity of the voting system? Because I understand from Professor Alex Henderson's presentation that Washington D.C. actually decided not to go on with the internet voting after they were able to show that it could be hacked. So from the experience that you had, have those countries given the public the opportunity to test the system, and what are the outcomes? Thank you.
Yeah, Ben, about piloting and testing of electronic voting.
I mean, I think it varies from country to country. Some countries have been very secretive about the development of the systems and have allowed very little access to those systems. Other countries have been very open and have even gone as far, as you say, to invite people to try and break the system, to try and hack into the system. I think Brazil is a good example of where that's been allowed. And they've invited people to come along and try and break the electronic voting machines, try and hack in and manipulate them. And while they were not successful in doing that, they did manage through that process to highlight some security flaws, which were then resolved by the election management body. So I think it's an important process to make sure that the machines work properly, but especially to try and build trust in those machines. I mean, people shouldn't blindly accept the machines work properly. It should be based on evidence and a factual basis.
Okay, we have time for one more question, I think, front here.
Yeah.
We have okay, two more questions, very quick questions, please.
Yes, please. I just want to know, in counting, in collation, do you generate the hard copies of the internet votes, or do you just pick the figures from the internet? Because you told us yesterday that the early voters who use ballot papers, you keep the votes till the election day when the votes are actually casted, and you count it along with the votes cast on the election day. But with internet voting, do you generate hard copies, or do you just go ahead and pick up the figures from the internet? Thank you.
How's the counting done in internet voting?
I mean, in all of the cases that I know, the vote is recorded electronically. The ballot is not printed out in any hard copy, and the server is just used to generate results for the election.
Okay. I think, okay. I think are we out of time, or one more? Okay, right there.
Just a question from the Philippines, where registration by voters we use biometrics. So how do you incorporate biometrics if you do online registration? And if you do online voting, how do you validate the voting using biometrics? Can this be done?
Sure, go ahead, David.
I'll take the registration part of that, at least. I think one of the challenges we have in the United States is that we don't have a national ID, and we don't have what I like to call a magic list, a list of all citizens in the United States. The states are responsible for it entirely. So countries that have a national list of citizens, or have biometrics associated with that list, or have a national ID card, already have a leg up, have an advantage in the game, where they can use that information to affirmatively go out and transfer people from that list to the registration list, including their biometric information, if that's relevant, if that country decides that that's relevant. As far as the other question, online voting, the biometrics.
I mean, I guess in principle it's possible if the identity infrastructure exists with biometrics having been collected as part of an ID card system. But I think it's a few steps beyond what we're seeing at the moment and what is feasible with current technology.
Okay. Well, I think we're out of time, so I want to thank the panelists, David Beirne, David Becker, and Ben Goldsmith, were really excellent presentations and an interesting discussion afterwards. I think we're taking a 5-minute break, and we're coming right back IFES, in collaboration with the National Democratic Institute, has a new publication coming out on electronic voting, and we will be talking about the publication in the next session. So we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Thank you, everyone.